evening and thank you for joining us. This is Live with Faye. I appreciate the fact that our audience comes in every night to be part of our conversation. At 8 p.m., where we talk about matters that are of importance to the country. Now, there's a story that popped up late last week that a lot of media houses missed, but it's a very important story. And that's what we're talking about today. But before I get to it, remember, like, share, subscribe, inform family members who might be interested in such conversations as well. The selling point is really that our panelists are top-notch in their field and they get to finish their sentences. And at the end of the 1 hour, we all learn something new. So tell family and friends that they can sign up for this. It's free. Come in every night at 8 o'clock and listen to the conversations where you can understand matters of our country better. Here's what we're talking about today. Now, last week, there was a CAG audit report that was tabled before Parliament. Of course, nobody in Parliament actually read it because the opposition was standing outside protesting. The government was inside passing bills at breakneck speed. But it was a very interesting audit. It was an audit, and the CAG is the auditor of the government. It audits all government work on all government accounts. So this was actually the standard audit that the CAG does on the books of accounts of the government of India for the year 2017-18. Now, this is what the CAG report said. It said that the government had wrongly retained 47,272,000 crore rupees instead of giving it to the states. Now, to explain to you what this means, it's fundamentally this. The government collects taxes. It is required, based on the GST Act, to transfer some portion of those taxes to various state governments as compensation for what they lost when they gave up their own taxes and adopted GST. Now, the law specifies that when the government collects taxes, it is meant to put a certain amount of those taxes in a special account. And that account is called the GST Compensation Fund. It's supposed to transfer the money into the GST Compensation Fund, and it's meant only to give that money to state governments. Now, what CAG is effectively saying is that the government did not transfer all the money it was supposed to the compensation fund. It kept 47,000 crore rupees in the Consolidated Fund of India. Now, the Consolidated Fund of India is the main bank account from which the government of India does business. It spends on all of the things it's supposed to spend on. And CAG effectively says that it spent the money on things other than what it was supposed to. Now, I must point out to you here that government has clarified since then, saying that there has been no diversion of the funds and that what had to happen was actually a reconciliation, which means we didn't do it right away. We were to do it in a few months. It hasn't, and the CAG report has missed that. But I must point out also that this clarification has come from Finance Ministry sources. There's no name attached to it. It's a source that these journalists are quoting. So the problem here is effectively that there is no official clarification that's come from the government. These are just sources who have called up the journalists and clarified this one point. But we would like to hear government give us an official clarification on what has happened to the money. Now, this is relevant for a couple of reasons. One, state governments are running out of funds. They've had to spend on railway tickets, sending migrants back to their cities. They've had to spend on all hospital care for COVID. They've lost a great deal of money because of COVID. And while they asked the central government to give them what is due, ironically, Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman said that there's no provision in the law to compensate states from the Consolidated Fund of India. So if you put all of this together, effectively, it means that the government is keeping money in the Consolidated Fund of India instead of giving it to the states, which is what it is supposed to do, and then saying, I'm sorry, according to the law, I can't take money out of the Consolidated Fund of India and give it to you. Why don't you take a loan instead? So these are the problems that we're tackling. So this is what we want to understand in the next 1 hour. Was this, in fact, a violation of the GST law? Do the state governments at this point, who are all pretty upset about the fact that they're running out of funds, do they have legal recourse? Are they likely to, or could they take government to court? And if the government says that this is not a problem, it's just reconciliation, then in that case, why isn't the government saying it from official sources. Now, to help us understand what's going on with this case, I have three very learned panelists join me right now. And what I love about all three of these people is that they are completely non-partisan, so they've never spoken for or against any of the governments. They're just independent voices. Mr. Kailash, Vasdev, and Ms. Geeta Luthra are both senior advocates for the Supreme Court. Good evening to both of you. Mr. Shailesh Gandhi is an RTI activist and the former Central Information Commissioner. He's really quite a brilliant voice, and I consider Mr. Gandhi the voice of the Indian citizen, really, more than anything else. So I'm glad he's given us time as well. Good evening to all of you. If I will please begin with Ms. Geeta Luthra. Ms. Luthra, is this a violation of the GST Act? Has the government broken the law from what you've seen and the CAG report that's come out so far?
From the CAG report, actually all CAG reports always point out, and it's like an audit of the government. So they always point out various paras showing where the government has gone wrong, where the spending is wrong. Now, in this case also, it shows, and it's not unusual. This is done year after year, showing where the government, and there are several paras which show various statutory bodies and the government and how the funding is happening and what's wrong with the funding. Then the government has an explanation to give when there are paras imputing to any organization, any aspect of government where they've gone wrong. In this case, it's right. What seems to be on the face of it, that government owes an explanation, because ultimately whatever semi-federal structure that we have depends on the states having some kind of funding. This funding was assured to them that they would, whenever there's a deficit of the GST, they would get this under the Compensation Cess Act. And it appears that there is a mismatch and the government has an explanation to give.
Ms. Luthra, if we consider the government's denial that has come via sources in the finance ministry, it says effectively that this was meant to be reconciled, and it was meant to be reconciled in the years to come. But it doesn't exactly confirm that the reconciliation happened. And since this was the financial year 2017-18, there's been enough time for that reconciliation to have happened until now. I find it slightly worrying that even in this sort of very vague clarification, there's no confirmation of the fact that, okay, we've reconciled it, so don't worry.
Yes. I think what they are saying is that we haven't reconciled it, and they had to do it by the June of the next year. And clearly, in a sense, I can only understand it as an admission that they are saying, of course, see, an explanation like this would take time. So you would take a month or 2 months to give an explanation, to put your accounts and put your best foot forward. So the government may have some time in such a serious finding by the CAG to give an explanation. But the fact is, you can't just say, I will reconcile it 10 years hence. You have to reconcile it by the June of the next year, and that's not done. So therefore, there clearly seems to be a lot of explanation that the government owes. And that's what the CAG is. It's the eyes and the ears to make sure that the expenditure is correctly done.
So if I've understood this correctly, that reconciliation should have happened by June 2019?
That's right.
Okay. So which means that if it hasn't happened, that law has clearly been broken. Mr. Kailash, Vasdev is with us as well. Mr. Vasdev, we've had conversations in the past of two state governments taking each other to court over, say, the water of the Kaveri and other such things. Is this room, if that reconciliation has not happened before June 2019, or if it hasn't happened yet, in fact, 2 years down, is there room here for state governments to approach the courts seeking that money, or seeking some sort of, relief?
Good evening. See, in so far as going to court is concerned, anybody likes to go to court. Question is, what kind of a right do you have? If you look at the scheme of the Constitution, funding of the states comes from the Consolidated Fund of India. It also comes into a contingency fund. Contingency is an emergent fund. But monies collected in the federal structure by the state or by the center are all pulled into the provisions of the Consolidated Fund under Article 266 of the Constitution. Once the money goes into the Consolidated Fund, then you're supposed to disperse it on a proportionate basis. The function of the CAG under Articles 148, 149, 150, 51 is to audit the accounts of the government. Now, when you carry out an audit, you might find shortfalls in the audit. The shortfalls in the audit may be incorrect accounting procedures, maybe relocating the funds, maybe keeping it in different purposes, maybe keeping it for different contingencies, because planned funds can be dispersed in different ways. Today, what has happened is that because of the present pandemic, as also I add another element to it, the pandemic, of course, has played havoc into every institution and every working system. But by practice, no government has followed a planned system where they can have a positive addition to the fund. They've always had deficit financing. Once you follow the principle of deficit financing, you will always find that money is always short. So your budgeting which takes place is a matter which has to be looked into all over again. And now looking at the present situation and the CAG report, the CAG report is going to be placed before Parliament in the directions of the President. Article 152 makes it clear. Moment you put it into the House, there should be a debate on it, and a healthy one at that. A healthy debate in a democracy, in a federal system, brings about a lot of reconciliations. Acrimony is a part of our system. It is human. You know, you didn't give me this, you promised this, I was entitled to this share, you've deprived me of this. And every state wants money for reasons. Some are official, some are an advantage to the state. So the GST format which came in 2004 or 2014, was it? Yes, 14, 15. It did away with taxes in a large number of areas. You got rid of excises, you got rid of the VAT, you got rid of the service tax, you got rid of every whole variety of taxes and consolidated them under a system. When this was done by the finance minister, he fixed a scale, 5%, 10%, 15%, 20%, depending up to 28%. So out of that tax collection, a lot of tax is collected locally in the states. When that money comes, it comes into the central fold, that is the Consolidated Fund of India. So disbursement is then planned that depending on what the state's requirements are, there are various considerations which go in. Today, the CAG says, look, you've taken away what the figure is 5.67% of the GST collections and appropriately and apportioned them in a different direction. The government says we haven't chosen to do that, but these are accounting anomalies, we'll sort them out. But for the CAG to point out that there is an incorrect appropriation of fund, or there is an audit procedure which is not correct, or an accounting procedure which is not correct, you know, it is a very intimidating statement for all of us. To rectify this, it is always better for a government to come up front and say, look, we didn't have the money, or this was our predicament, or this is what we did. We had to give extra money to so-and-so state because of certain contingencies, maybe a flood, maybe anything. But I think when a CAG report comes, we should have a healthy debate in Parliament, because this is becoming a ritual affair. After all, the report is placed by the President. The President is the head of our country. He's placing it before the parliamentarians who are supposed to be representing our interests in the larger interest of a federal structure and the interest of democracy. Have an open debate about it, discuss it, find out where the errors are, bring about rectifications, and then proceed to the next question.
Mr. Vasdev, the last session of Parliament was wrapped up only last week. Was that healthy debate? Did you see that as adequate?
Look, personally speaking, there's a lot of things I can say on this one. A lot of things which we feel shouldn't happen. As a matter of fact, last week, because of this pandemic, we're getting a lot of time to catch up on our readings. I was reading some international conventions, especially in the British Parliament, and also the terrible impasse which has hit the USA after the demise of a judge who was very popular and very well respected. So as far as democratic patterns are concerned, they change from election to election. They change from time to time, and they change on the requirement of the time at that given point of time. So there is much to be said back, much to be said good, much to be said peculiar, much to be said odd. But one thing we must remember in all that we debate and discuss, we are essentially a democracy. In a democracy, we must learn to respect each other. Parliamentary forms, bicameral houses, the Lok Sabha, the Rajya Sabha. In the states also, cameral houses, bicameral houses. We must learn to respect each other, not throw mics at each other. So in this kind of a situation, a lot of states which are not run by the BJP are complaining about the non-availability of funds. You know, one must sit and debate these matters over. It will take a lot of acrimony. It will help a lot of people, and it will bring about a certain amount of respect for the parliamentary system of democracy. My view is, whenever there's a CAG report, please have a healthy discussion. Put across your points of view. You may have disagreements. Budget for it in the next budget. If you have funds available now, release them.
Yes.
Because money is not being taken by the state for private purposes. It is being used for state development, education, infrastructure, salaries, or I don't know, tens and thousands of things. So have a discussion, debate it, work it out. Don't avoid a discussion. It doesn't take you anyplace.
Shamita Dasgupta has asked, do states have the option of not sending GST collections from their respective states to the union government? I don't believe they get to touch the money at all. It goes to the union government, and the union government has to route it back to them. So that's how GST works, which is where the problem arises. I just want to bring in Mr. Shailesh Gandhi. Mr. Gandhi, I ask you now, citizen to citizen, do you believe there should be a better clarification from the government or the finance ministry to come out and not just clear the air with the state governments, but also with citizens? Tell us what is going on. What is the state of affairs as far as money is concerned? Because state governments say they've run out of money completely. And we know that this entire burden right now of treating India for COVID is with the state governments. Should there be clearer communication, Mr. Gandhi?
To be honest, I think we need to look at something very fundamental about this CAG report. It's a report for the financial year 2018-19.
Yes.
So we are talking of something 17 or 18 months post the event. COVID has nothing to do with this, firstly.
Yes.
In 2018, I don't think any one of us even forecast COVID or thought of COVID. It would have been a scientific fiction novel if it had done that.
Yes.
Therefore, firstly, I think we need to start questioning, is this the right practice? Limited companies, public limited companies, which are fairly large also, and have commercial transactions, audit their annual reports and also have audited reports which they present before the public in less than 6 months after the financial year ends. So most public limited companies for the last year would have submitted their audited balance sheets for the year by September 2019. Whereas 1 year later, we are discussing this. Secondly, it is obvious the government, the central government, does not have enough money. And therefore, it is asking the states to fund this. And what is amazing is 43% of the collection for 2018-19 has not been credited to the states, which is an amazing amount. It's a very huge amount. In fact, I suspect the COVID year will be much worse. 2019-20 will be much worse, but we will learn about it and discuss it maybe at your program in 2021 September. Is this the right way for a nation to function? How tolerant are we? We talk of transparency. What are we talking about? We are talking of something after 15 months after the event. There is just no reason why it cannot be done within 6 months. And our corporates are doing it across the country with international ramifications. Therefore, my submission is something is very seriously wrong and we will not know what is wrong. What we are doing is an absolute post-mortem. This kind of CAG audit report, I don't think helps anybody.
Yes.
It is okay as a discussion point, but it's not even worth looking at. CAG must by itself start giving its report within 6 months of the close of the financial year for it to make any sense, for it to call for any accountability.
Yes, because technically it's an NDA government led by the same party, but on paper this is a different government. There was an election in 2019 and a different government took over. But I want to take
I'm sorry, just 1 second. If we know what is happening, citizens will question, media will question. If you know about something 1.5 years later, what sense does it make?
Absolutely. Let me take that very valid point to my other panelists as well, Ms. Luthra. You know, it's a valid point. We're talking about this 2 years later, in the very least, like we were saying. And Mr. Gandhi is of the opinion that this sort of a report or audit doesn't help anyone. I want to understand from a legal point of view, do you believe it doesn't help anyone, or is there still use of something like this?
Yes.
Yes.
There is use, and I believe that this is the manner in which reports are given. In fact, there was a much controversy when this CAG was appointed, and in his own way, he may have indicated himself. Now, the fact is that all this emanates from the Indian Audit and Account Service. Indian Audit and Account Service is not as, they haven't been given the statutory authority. The CAG ultimately, various aspects of what the CAG report consists of is done under different heads under the Audit and Account Service. And they're all doing a salutary job. They try and do it according to the best auditory principles. They've been trained by years of service. So the fact is, such a report, I know Mr. Gandhi seems to be disagreeing. I'm very happy that you are disagreeing. We learn more from disagreement than from agreement. But the fact is that then they suggest corrective methods. Now, when he's saying it's a little too late, the fact is it is late, I agree. It is late. And we just, the point we were saying that it should have been done in several months. You're talking of June 19 at the latest, that you had to do a reconciliation, pay the money to the states. What it does, because ultimately power is about economic power. And if there is no economic power to the states, then, GST was to function on a basis where you were removing the central sales tax and the state sales tax, and you were bringing a uniform law. The whole principle was a trust principle that the states would not be done out of their funding. Now, if the states are even temporarily being outdone in their funding or not being given their funding, then the question is this diversion? And how serious is it? Now, normally the CAG in its report also suggests corrective paras, and those corrective paras then have to be looked at by in this case, the center, and it's a very serious aspect. Center has to respond, and I'm sure they will respond on the floor. I don't know how it will go, but it's bound to be fiery. But that is what I think. And Mr. Gandhi can then comment on his viewpoint.
Mr. Gandhi, do you want to respond?
Ma'am, incidentally, I mean, on the parliamentary debates and TV channels are reflecting each other. I don't know who's leading, I'm not too sure. However, let me again point out that getting a report 1.5 years later is a meaningless exercise. You cannot use this as a correction. You just use it as explanations. So therefore, we explain something. We need to insist. We've got rules which are outmoded. We say justice can be delivered after 30 years. CAG accounting reports can come after 1.5 years, and then there'll be explanations given for the next 6 months, perhaps.
Yeah.
We need to insist that CAG reports must be prepared within 6 months of the end of the financial year. And this is what corporates are doing. It's not something new I'm talking of. It's not as if there is...
Agreed. But you know, Mr. Gandhi, as a citizen, and I just want to point out one thing, and I'll take this to Mr. Vasdev, because we know as citizens and as small business owners, or Mr. Vasdev runs a practice, the tax department will happily send you a notice for something that happened 10 years ago and ask you to cough up your, your accounts and your details from 7 years ago, from 8 years ago, for the last 5 years. And they'll sit and they'll nitpick on everything. And what is the penalty within the GST law for not paying your dues back in 2017-18 and saying today in September 2020 that is reconciliation really, or looking at it differently? Would the GST, would the government and the tax authorities allow either a private business or a private individual to get away with something like this, even if it happened 3 years ago? Mr. Vasdev?
You see, in accounting principles, year's accounts come to an end on the 31st of March. Now, once the accounts come to an end, you send it for an audit. In our country, if you recall the old days, the budget used to be announced for the next fiscal year on the 28th of February of the year coming in. It has now changed. It began to change for different circumstances. I won't comment on the political goodness or the wrongness of it. But we had a firm system. 28th February, the budget used to be pronounced. The terms of the budget became statute law, and the grants or the releases of funds or the collection of money or the fixation of tariffs or the fixation of prices was maintained throughout the year. This began to change in 2004-05, when by notifications we began to change tax structures. Personally speaking, I think it is wrong, because by notifications you cannot alter an act. It's subordinate legislation. But now take, for example, the price of essential commodities, petrol, diesel. They fluctuate on the day because you say we have taken it outside the purview of the Act, and we will now permit price fixation on a day-to-day basis depending on international market prices. If you were to follow that principle, the price of petrol and diesel should drop, not increase. I'm giving an instance of how we play with our systems. Now we come to the CAG report. The CAG says your allocation of funds has not been properly followed, so therefore rectify it. If the funding of the nation can be presented in a budget on a particular date, you will have the funds of the previous year available to you before you frame the budget. Political considerations apart, because in the budget, you give relaxations to a certain class of people, to a certain industry, to a certain development. But the overall fund availability to the government under the consolidated fund is known to you on the date that you present the union budget. If that figure is available to you, why can't you complete the audit in good time so that the whole occasion, now see 2017-18 allocation of funds, we are discussing in 1920, actually 2021. So now for 2 years, there's been a hiatus. What has happened 2 years ago has suddenly become of no consequence because the defenses available for protecting the actions taken are totally different. You will say international prices have gone up, COVID prices have gone up, cost of living indices have changed, but you have these figures to you. Why can't you complete an audit which will give the nation a clearer picture? Not that the nation wants to know, but we have got to tell the nation what it has. So you see, in those circumstances, the CAG plays a very vital role in maintaining a certain balance between the people, parliament, and the availability of funds, because you plan your budgets on taxation. You plan your year on the basis of what is available to you. When the GST came, it rollicked most of us because suddenly you found that the prices of the amount of tax which you were paying on elements went up from 8 to 10% to almost 28% on cars. Import duties also changed. It went to 35%. So you see, when you are looking at a budget, you've got to keep the CAG in mind because he is the ombudsman for the nation. Being the ombudsman, follow his dictates, don't damn him because he's not getting anything out of it. He's saying, look, this is what I feel you've gone wrong. And where you've done a good job, he compliments you.
Yes.
So see, the CAG is the ombudsman. He is the bridge between the people and governance insofar as the funding is concerned. The economic power of the country depends on what the budget says. Therefore, it is vital. Now, you had asked me a question earlier whether the states can go to court. Nothing stops anybody from going to court. But in fiscal matters, normally courts won't entertain these proceedings because it is something which is not in their ken. How much money is to be released, how much money is to be utilized. Those come under the scheme of the Constitution, Article 226, Article 266 onwards. Financial grants, allocation of funds, debates in the House. Those are the elements. The court cannot possibly decide what is right, wrong, or indifferent. They don't have the wherewithal. They will pronounce in the law, but how can you pronounce on figures and economic policy of government? You cannot do it.
But if the CAG alleges that the government violated the law, Mr. Vasdev.
There's no violation of. They're not saying you violated the law. He says you have changed the alteration. You have altered the system of allocation of funds. That's not the law.
Well, to quote the CAG precisely, it says this is a violation of the law.
See, I would disagree with this. The violation of the law would come if there was a notified procedure for the allocation of funds to the states in accordance with the scheme of the Constitutional Consolidated Fund of India, as also the remaining provisions of the Constitution as to how to appropriate funds. But appropriation of funds by a notification or by an announcement is not a mandate which the government must follow. It can change. Circumstances are there. Why do you have an Article 267 contingency fund? To deal with an extraordinary such a situation. You have Article 266. I mean, just for your information. If you see the introductions in the Constitution, I have it right before me. Taxes levied and distributed within the union and state. So you will be governed by Articles 268, 269, 269A, etc., etc., etc. So you see, these are procedures. These are allocations of funds. I would never call money distribution to be the law. I would be loath to do it. You can arrange for it because these are in anticipation that this is what you will receive. So therefore, this is a percentage you will allot. You may or may not be able to allot. You may or may not be able to collect. What happens then? Mr. Gandhi is right in saying 2017-18, we didn't have any extraordinary circumstance. An answer which the government is now seeking to give 2 years down the track. This is where the matter needs to be looked at. The CAG must come into action immediately on the year closing on the 31st of March in that calendar year, in that financial year. Moment the CAG report comes, because the data is available to the CAG. Why must you drag your feet over 2 years? If there's an extraordinary circumstance, yes. If there's a particular incident, yes. But on the whole, all figures are available to you.
Okay.
Why should the CAG delay?
Yeah, I just want to read out from the CAG report, and it's a massive report of 92 pages. I'm reading off page 47 for those of our audience members who are enthusiastic and want to actually go in and read it. On page 47, in the second paragraph under the table 2.8, it says short crediting is a violation of the GST Compensation Cess Act of 2017. So the CAG actually, it is recommended to the Ministry of Finance to take immediate corrective action. Yes, page number 47, second paragraph, third paragraph, GST compensation cess. Let me take this back to Shailesh, Gandhi, and Geeta, Luthra. Mr. Gandhi, you wanted to respond on whether treatment of private citizens in private companies would be different from for the treatment the government sort of hands to itself. And the question that a lot of our audience members are asking is, can states stop sending GST money to the government of India and keep it for themselves?
A, you are right. This is a law according to the CAG report, and therefore it's a violation of the law, as far as I can figure out. I mean, I'm no lawyer, but the CAG says so. Maybe 1.5 years later, but fair enough. 1.5 years later, at least they say law is being violated. As far as going to court is concerned, my guess is if it matter goes to court, it will be decided in a decade's time. So that is no solution. And we have a very funny thing which most of us don't notice. The central government is now telling state governments that they will allow borrowing. So it is something like this: I owe you some money, I will not pay you, but I'll tell you, you go and borrow from a bank or from an RBI, which is a very peculiar thing. The central government must honor its commitment in the GST. This is money that rightfully belongs to the states and must be given to them.
No,
And
you're right.
another funny thing, in 1718, the total collection was much lower, which had to be transferred, but more amount was transferred. On the other hand, in 1819, though the amount of transfer amount went up to about 95,000 crores, the actual amount transferred was only 54,000 crores, 2,000 crores less than the previous year. At this rate, what will happen in the COVID years is God alone knows. None of us knows how it can be done. But I think the center must stick by the law in letter and in spirit.
Miss Luthra?
Yes, so the first aspect first, do you think that they can go to court of law? I would probably agree with Mr. Vasudev. We can't go to, you normally on such matters, you don't go to a court of law. You raise it in parliament, and the fact is that since CAG is as statutory an authority as a Supreme Court judge, and he has great sanctity, and the matter goes to the PAC, a Parliamentary Accounts Committee, which will look at it, and the CAG gives it questions that it should raise for the government. I think that's the manner in which it has to be tested and answered. Now, can the states withhold the money? I don't think they can. See, the customs excise officers, which is a central service, is the one that is looking after GST. So though there is the state GST or the center GST, fact is it's being manned by these officers. And I don't exactly know the working, but to my mind, it's customs and excise officers who work as a part and parcel of the GST department of Government of India, as well as in the states. So a person who is in an all India service is not going to say, I'm not going to send the money, because he's the one who's collecting the funds one way or the other. The fact is, it has to go back to the states, because we already have a quasi-federal structure. We already don't have a federal structure. If the promise on which GST was introduced was that we will make sure that the states will get funding, then we can't get into this, and we can't be telling that I'm taking from Peter and I'm telling Peter, now you borrow from me or borrow from a bank. You owe the money. You may as well give them the money. If it was a private citizen, which was your question, you'd have to pay with tax and penalty and whatnot. So that is, according to me, the answer. The center may not have to do that, won't have to do that, but at least let them not be with a begging bowl for what is rightfully theirs. Just because there is this legal aspect that they can't get from the consolidated fund, it has to be transferred to another fund, and from there it has to go to the states. That can't be an argument. So I think we need an argument, a defense which will be raised in Parliament, and therefore it's not to be said, maybe that's the reason they haven't spoken,
Yes.
to publicly, because they will have to answer this in Parliament to the PSC.
Well, I just want to point out very mildly and helpfully here that for an individual, if you fail to pay your GST on time, it is 100 rupees every day for late filing and subject to a maximum of 5,000 rupees. And then after that, there's also talk of some part of jail term as well for failing to pay your GST. And my question is very simply, why are the rules different for us as individuals? And the government cannot pay its dues for 2 full years and doesn't even feel the need to give an official communication and clear the air. What is this source-based information that the finance ministry is putting out, and why aren't they speaking to us clearly? Mr. Vasdev, go ahead.
See, the GST is an act been framed by government. It doesn't apply to government because government is not a tax collecting, is not an agency which pays tax, it collects the tax. So therefore the taxation system says that if you don't pay the tax, you're liable to pay penalties. But once the tax is collected by the government, there is nothing excepting for the scheme of the constitution which permits a disbursement. So per se, the GST Act will apply to those who are in default of payment of taxes, not to those who are in default of distribution of the tax collected. There are two totally separate gamuts. And as far as the constitutional scheme is concerned, in the past 30 years, as one sees it, really from 1973, 74 onwards, that's more than 30 years as a matter of fact, we have systematically done away with convention. It began at that point of time with our prime minister. It then carried on. Then there was a messing up of the entire accounting system. We had short-term prime ministers who looked at only a short-term gain as long as they were in office. You know, the Gowdas and the Gujrals and the like. We had short-term prime ministers, Chandrasekhar, who were really propped up people. So what happens in those circumstances? Constitutional conventions break down. Unfortunately, in the period that you had the longest serving prime minister, the constitutional conventions were not restored. You had an opportunity. In the period 2000 to 2005, there was a balanced approach. In the period 90 to 95, there was a balanced approach with Mr. Narasimha Rao trying to keep the governments together. Atal Bihari did the same thing. But when you had an absolute majority, you didn't restore any constitutional schemes. Therefore, I blame the political leaders of our country today that they are not looking at the future, nor are they looking at building up a good convention. Good governance always gives you good results. Good convention always builds relationships. Money is an issue which will always be a matter of brickbats. If you borrow money from somebody, you don't pay money from somebody, you feel this fellow is liable to pay me money, it always leads to a certain amount of animus. In the case of the states and the center, they must both realize that they're working for the people, not for themselves. And in that convention, you must restore a certain faith in the democratic principles. Now, the CAG, as I said before, is the ombudsman. He gives a report, honor it, follow it, remedy the faults. You will do the nation a favor. If you choose not to do it, you will undo whatever has been built up as a matter of planning. Yes. Whether it's a 5-year plan or it's a long-term plan or it's a short, you require economic planning. You require an economic policy. You require an economic system. The Constitution provides these conventions. Acting in the breach is not going to take anyone any place. You can't flex your muscles and say, no, I'm the only one. No, it doesn't work. The hustings test you 5 years later. And when the hustings test you, these things come to fore. Because the new person who comes in, assuming there's a change in parties in the next elections, they will say this was done as a precedent in the past. What stops me from doing it? Precisely what they're saying today. They happened in the past, I've done it. The other governments have done it, I will do the same thing. But that's not a good precedent. You must be in a position to accept the fact that there has to be change and change for the better. We're a 70-year-old democracy. Those faiths have to be restored.
Absolutely. I'm actually thinking that unless any of our panelists want to come in and add anything else, I think that the last word of that one paragraph in the CAG report sums up what needs to be done. It says it is recommended that the Ministry of Finance take immediate corrective action. And that is really the final word. Now, there are, of course, worrying points that 2017-18 was a good financial year for this country because fuel prices were down, business was doing well. This was effectively, we hadn't been hit severely by the blows that have weakened us this year. But the finance ministry might have to find the money to make good on this if this is what the CAG has found. And at a time when states are really crippled by lack of tax collection, nobody's buying fuel really. It's a difficult time for everyone. So we have our fingers crossed on the fact that two things will happen. The Ministry of Finance will take immediate corrective action as recommended by the CAG and will communicate in a more clear fashion with both state governments and citizens of this country. I want to thank Ms. Luthra, Mr. Vasdev, and Mr. Gandhi for being so kind and giving us your time and helping us understand this better. Thank you so much. For our audience, thank you for joining us. We have a conversation coming up at 9 o'clock that I think you'll find very interesting. Do stay with us. Kanhaiya Kumar joins me to talk about what's going on in Bihar and to explain his silence about everything that's happened so far, including the migrant crisis and the arrest of his associate Umar Khalid. That's coming up at 9 o'clock. Get a cup of coffee, come back and join us. Thank you.